You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Missouri. Missouri does fine jewelry differently. They're all about buying for yourself, where you decide the occasion. Everything is handcrafted with quality, craftsmanship, and responsible sourcing in mind. So these are pieces you can feel good about in more ways than one. Plus, there are so many designs you can mix and match to create a stack for every look. Shop online at Missouri.com or in-store today.
This episode is brought to you by Skinny Pop Popcorn. Perfectly popped, endlessly delicious. Oh, so light and crunchy. Skinny Pop Original Popcorn is the snack you've been searching for. Made with just 3 simple ingredients: popcorn kernels, sunflower oil, and salt. Snacking never felt or tasted so good. Perfectly popped, endlessly delicious. Give yourself permission to snack and pick up Skinny Pop Original Popcorn today.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 199, The Fall of France, Failure at Abbeville. This week, a big thank you goes out to Einar, Nathan, Joe, Mark, Peter, Christopher, and Eel Coved M, I guess, for supporting the podcast by becoming members. Members can get access to special member-only episodes, like the latest episode on a British report entitled British Strategy in a Certain Eventuality, with that eventuality being the defeat of France. Kind of just a deep dive into what the British were planning to do if France was defeated. You can find out more about becoming a member over at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. During the last week of May, the Germans had a problem. Their attack into France and Belgium had gone very, very well, and the BEF and a major portion of the French army were now trapped. The hard-marching German infantry divisions had moved into positions where any kind of breakout attempt was impossible, and it was clear that operations in the north had transitioned into a mopping-up exercise. Back at German High Command, this meant that focus shifted away from the operations in the north and instead to what would come after, and into what would come to be known as Fall Rot, or Case Red. The basic outline of this plan was contained within Führer Directive 13, which would be issued on May 24, 1940. The goal of the new operation was simple: the destruction of any remaining British and French forces, and at least the initial plans were far more focused on this goal than the capture of French territory. This would be accomplished by first pushing German forces over the Somme River, which is where they had been after the advance to the sea, and then moving to the Seine River to the south. This would break the French defensive lines and bring the German forces into contact with Paris. However, that is where the attacks would end, and at least in this area of the front, and they would use the Seine as a pause point while the second phase of the attack was launched. The goal of this second effort was to push south to Reims and then to attack the Maginot Line from behind. Overall, the plan was very focused on military objectives, the destruction of the French and British forces, and not applying additional pressure to the French government to possibly surrender, which is what would end up happening. If they had known about the rise of defeatism among French leadership, a more aggressive path may have been chosen by the Germans that may have brought even quicker results, even though they'd be pretty quick anyway. After the planning was done, the attack was scheduled for the first week of June, which would result in frantic activity behind the lines as the German forces were prepared. If the German forces were going to be able to launch the attack during the first week of June, a timetable that Hitler demanded that they meet, they really only had 10 days to begin the attack after the May 24th directive. And there were 2 major problems that they were going to have to solve if they wanted to do that. The first was relatively straightforward. They had to get all of the mobile units out of the front line as quickly as possible. One of the developments that the podcast has been tracking was the separation of the German armored and motorized units from the foot-marching infantry divisions, and how long it was taking for the infantry to catch up. This meant, most importantly, that after the Germans reached the coast at Abbeville and captured some bridgeheads over the Somme River, the armored and motorized forces were forced to hold those bridgeheads. Now, they did a fine job holding them. They would withstand multiple French and British counterattacks, but they were kind of a poor tool for the job, and their continued stint in the front line prevented them from the rest, reorganization, and resupply that was required before they could play a major role in a further attack. This was a problem that could only be solved with time, with infantry divisions replacing the mobile divisions as the infantry arrived at the front. When they arrived, units were then shuffled, and the mobile units were allowed at least a few days of rest, with most of them sort of getting at least 3 to 4 days of rest before they were moving back into the front line to prepare for their next effort. Getting the infantry to the front was just one of the problems, and once the sort of mobile units were able to move out of the front line, the more difficult problem had to be solved: how to replace what had been lost during the campaign so far. While the campaign, the invasion of France, had gone quite well and had, been pretty quick, the path from the Ardennes to the North Sea had been traversed sort of in a matter of days, but their actions had taken a serious toll on the German mobile formations. Often this toll was not necessarily maybe in destroyed tanks or vehicles, but instead just simple breakdowns or even minor battle damage. Ideally, there would be tank recovery and repair units in place to take care of these, but the Germans at this point in the war were desperately short of these units, having prioritized combat troops in the lead up to the attack into France. This meant that for vehicles that had any kind of serious damage, the only option was to send them all the way back to Germany for repair, because the facility simply did not exist closer to the front. This type of movement was just added to the long list of things that had to be moved around the area: men, ammunition, supplies, replacement vehicles, and countless other items were all being either pushed forward or pushed back over the damaged Belgian and French infrastructure. This damage had been caused by the actions of both the Allies and the Germans, and not just due to aerial bombardment or attempted demolition, but just simple wear and tear. The slow degradation of transport infrastructure behind the attacking Germans, due to simple overuse and abuse, would be a much bigger part of the story once we get to Russia. But even here in France and Belgium, it was already a major concern during periods of frantic activity, like the last week of May 1940, as so much material was being pushed forward as quickly as possible. Along with the simple and straightforward resupply operations, there were also some efforts to reorganize the German forces based on lessons learned from the earlier attacks. The biggest change was that the mobile forces were reorganized into 5 motorized corps, with 2 panzer divisions and 1 motorized infantry division in each motorized corps. Now, previously, the motorized infantry divisions had been kept in their own corps, away from the armored units. The hope was that this change would kind of allow the armored and motorized infantry to be able to work more closely together, which had been and would be a major problem during this campaign and future campaigns. For the French, they actually had a pretty good understanding of what the Germans were planning, with the expectations among French high command being that the Germans would launch a 2-pronged attack, with one using the Somme bridgeheads to push to the Seine, while the other pushed south towards Rheims, which was pretty much exactly what they planned. Good job, French. Attempts were made to prepare the French forces, or what remained of them, but there was precious little time for the French army to reorganize itself along the new defensive line, and to prepare to meet a possible attack towards Rheims. With all the planning and preparations at a high level, fighting would still continue along the front throughout the last week of May and into June. Even if these actions were not part of a larger offensive, they would still have important ramifications for the future attack, because if the French could eliminate even one of the German bridgeheads, it would make their future defensive operations much easier. While there would be some level of action at each of the bridgeheads, the bridgehead at Abbeville would receive particular focus during the last days of May. The Germans had been able to expand the bridgehead over the Somme in this area to about 8 kilometers in depth and 14 kilometers wide, with the area held, at least initially, by some motorized infantry regiments with support from artillery and 4 88mm flak guns. They would be faced by a combined British and French force, which would be organized into 2 different groups, with the relatively simple objectives of simply slamming into the German forces and pushing them back. The two forces would both feature a British armored brigade from the 1st Armored Division and then a French light cavalry division. This meant that each attacking force would contain about 90 tanks, so 180 combined, or so, roughly, which was a powerful force, but it would be hampered by two problems. The first was the challenge often faced by British and French forces, coordination, which at times made it difficult to, sort of at a small unit level, to properly work together and support one another. The second problem is that neither of the attacking forces had much understanding of what they were about to face, with the British and French forces arriving in the sector just before the attack, which did not allow much time for reconnaissance or really to even gain a real understanding of the terrain. The attack was scheduled to begin early on the morning of May 27th. With a very brief delay, the British tanks would begin rolling at about 6 a.m. The first attacks were hampered by early morning fog, which caused the British tanks to move sort of slowly and cautiously forward. There would then be several instances where they encountered early and strong resistance that would inflict serious damage on some of the armored units. One example of this was the 10th Hussars, which would begin the attack and then encounter a German outpost line not far from their initial jumping-off point. Among the units on this line were the 14th Panzer Abwehr Company, or anti-tank company, of the 25th Infantry Regiment. They would have one PaK-36 3.7cm anti-tank gun near a village, which the 10th Hussars were advancing towards. Now, the Germans had early warning of the attack because they were able to clearly hear the sound of British tank engines before they arrived, and this allowed them to be prepared when the tanks of the 10th Hussars arrived just before or just after 6:30 a.m. What would follow is a textbook example of what a well-prepared, highly motivated anti-tank unit could do against an unprepared enemy. The Germans waited until the first British tanks were just 200 meters away before opening fire, and then started rapid firing and quickly knocked out two tanks. At only a few hundred meters, it did not matter what part of the British tanks the Germans were hitting, because the anti-tank gun that they were using could penetrate even the thickest of the British frontal armor. What would follow was 20 minutes of the Germans firing and moving their anti-tank gun faster than the British tankers could coordinate their return fire. In those 20 minutes, the gun would fire almost 100 rounds and destroy 10 British tanks. More importantly, for the overall course of the attack, these types of actions often resulted in exactly what the Germans wanted. The 10th Hussars were forced to retreat. But that's all they needed. That was victory for the Germans. It is perhaps worth stating that this was not just due to German fire. They didn't just retreat because of the German sort of anti-tank gun, but also due to some mechanical breakdowns among the British tanks, which meant that after just over an hour of combat, they were down to about half of the tanks which they started with an hour before, which was a pretty rough situation. This type of template was actually repeated in several other areas of the attack as well. For example, near the village of Bois de la Meuse, the British tanks of the Queen's Bays would be hit hard by another anti-tank gun, which quickly destroyed several of their tanks and forced the attack to be cancelled. Even when a few of the tanks in this instance were actually able to outflank the position and continue the advance, they then ran into two 88mm flak guns, which completely tore them apart. In total, the Queen's Bays would lose 12 tanks, and again, more importantly, it would end with them retreating back to their start line. A few of the British armored units did better. They sort of achieved a little bit more, with, for example, many of the units of the 3rd Armored Brigade on the western side of the bridgehead having more success. Unfortunately, as they advanced, they found that they did not have enough supporting infantry with them, and as the German forces recovered from the attack, the British tanks would eventually be forced to withdraw, again, because they didn't have infantry to actually hold the ground or fully flush out the Germans. By the end of their efforts, the British 1st Armored had lost 120 tanks, fully 2/3 of the 180 tanks that they possessed, although only about 60 of those were due to German actions, with the rest being, again, mechanical issues. Either way, it meant that the 1st Armored Division lost most of its combat capabilities for very little gain. A number that puts things into perspective is that the British would end the day with 120 tanks out of action, which outnumbered the number of German wounded from the fighting, with the Germans having just 40 killed and 110 wounded during the British attacks. While the British had made little progress, the French units had joined them in this attack, and they had actually made some headway, both on the 27th and then really early on the 28th. But most of these gains were kind of on the periphery of the bridgehead, which primarily at the two ends, the extreme ends of the bridgehead to the north and south. And one of the reasons for this is that this was territory that the Germans were more willing to give up and did not include any real gains directly towards Abbeville, which would have threatened the entire bridgehead. Today's podcast is proudly sponsored by Fold 3, the web's premier collection of military records that helps bring the events of World War II history to life. Immerse yourself in over 670 million records as you explore photographs, individual service records, formerly classified military documents, and more. Learn how the greatest generation's triumphs and sacrifices impacted history as you take a front row seat to epic tales of courage, sacrifice, resilience, and valor. Have a veteran in your family? On Fold 3, you can combine records found on the site with what you have in your own albums and shoeboxes and attics to create an online memorial for someone who served. Discover your military ancestors today at fold3.com.
This episode is brought to you by Missouri. Missouri does fine jewelry differently. They're all about buying for yourself, where you decide the occasion. Everything is handcrafted with quality, craftsmanship, and responsible sourcing in mind. So these are pieces you can feel good about in more ways than one. Plus, there are so many designs you can mix and match to create a stack for every look. Shop online at Missouri.com or in-store today.
While the fighting was occurring on the morning of the 27th, at that same time, both sides were bringing in reinforcements, which would continue the actions in the days that followed. On the German side, the infantry troops of the 57th Infantry Division were arriving, and they were able to move across the river and into the bridgehead to relieve the motorized infantry units, which were primarily being moved off the line in preparation for the next attack into France. Fortunately for the Germans, these troops arrived and relief operations were completed before the British and French forces could renew the attack. This was because the Allied efforts were delayed until new forces arrived in the area, specifically the French armored forces commanded by de Gaulle and the British 51st Highland Infantry Division. These forces would not arrive in the area until the middle of the afternoon on May 28th, primarily due to the fact that by this point in the campaign, the French armored forces were only moving at night due to concerns about the constant and dangerous nature of German air attacks. The British division had been transported all the way from the Sarre region in eastern France, and over the course of the week, it had been on many journeys by road and rail to make the trip. The end result of these travels is that the division needed time to assemble and reorganize before it would be able to effectively enter combat. This was a problem because the longer the British and French waited to go in for another attack, the stronger the German resistance would be, and therefore de Gaulle decided that the best course of action was to launch an attack as early as possible. This attack would begin on the same afternoon that his forces began to arrive, May 28th. De Gaulle had a solid force under his command by this point, including not just about every type of British tank, some armored cars, some anti-tank batteries, 3 battalions of infantry, and also artillery support. He was also provided with additional artillery support just for this attack, pulled from French Army-level artillery reserves. As he was planning what he would do, de Gaulle was balancing preparations and speed, but he did at least have good information about what had happened the day before. This meant that the basic outline of the German positions were generally known, which made the planning for the attack a bit easier. The key piece of information that the French and de Gaulle did not have at this point was that the Germans had been able to swap out the divisions, and that instead of the motorized infantry that had been in the fighting the previous day, de Gaulle would be facing the newly arrived 57th Infantry. This was problematic because the German infantry brought with them more anti-tank guns and just more men in general. The plan that was developed by the French was a simple concentric attack on the German positions, with the French attempting to attack from a multitude of different directions simultaneously to overwhelm the German defenders. It would occur as quickly as possible, with some of the tank battalions, particularly those of the slower-moving Char B1 bis tanks, being provided with just 30 minutes to refuel, resupply, and prepare for the attack after they arrived at their jumping-off points. While I'm sure the French soldiers would have preferred a little bit more rest, it is interesting to note here that de Gaulle was pushing forward his armored units much quicker than a lot of other French armored commanders had earlier in the campaign. If you remember back to the episodes on the battles around Sedan, one of the primary sort of criticisms leveled at the French generals at the time, and by me in this podcast, is that the armored generals were not pushing their units to attack fast enough. They always attacked too late or not even at all because the battlefield conditions would change. Here at least, even though we'll talk about the results here in a moment, at least in this instance, de Gaulle was doing what armored forces really needed to do, which was to attack as quickly as possible. Not give the enemy more time to solidify their positions, not give them more time to build up more anti-tank forces. You just kind of had to go, and that's what de Gaulle was doing here. The primary point of emphasis for de Gaulle's attack was the exact same village that the 10th Hussars had attacked the day before, but this attack had 32 of the big Char B1 bis tanks, which were committed along with several units of French infantry. Just as important was the presence of French artillery, and the French 105mm howitzers would fire 6,000 rounds at the village in just 15 minutes before the attack began. The French would then attack with their pretty much standard tactical doctrine, with company-sized groups of tanks followed by infantry. Now, there was one primary reason that this attack would be successful where the British had failed, and that was the fact that the French tanks could shrug off the German anti-tank fire without receiving any real damage. This came as a major shock to the German infantry troops within the village, who believed that when they opened fire, their guns would be effective, just as they had been against almost all types of Allied tanks that had been faced so far. But the Char B1s were one of the few exceptions. And so instead of being destroyed quickly when one of the anti-tank rounds hit their frontal armor, the Chars just kept on coming. The tanks were not completely impervious to the fire from the German guns. There were areas of the tank that were vulnerable to anti-tank fire, like for example, the tracks are always a problem with tanks. But it often took many hits to hit that area, and even sometimes then, it was still okay. For example, one of the Chars, named the Jeanne d'Arc, would take 30 direct hits while it destroyed 2 German anti-tank guns before its 75mm gun was damaged by another shell. But even without its main gun, it was still running, and so it continued towards the German positions and physically destroyed several more German sort of positions that they had set up. With little that they could do to stop the French tanks, the German forces fell back to a local chateau, before eventually surrendering at 9:30 p.m. When the losses were totaled, the French had captured the village with just 6 dead and 12 wounded. Even before the German forces surrendered, the French armored units were already pushing forward again, with their next objective being a vital crossroads. During this phase, the negative side of the Char B1 tanks would come into play. And when they moved into the final attack on the crossroads, just 6 of the 19 tanks were still running, with almost all of the losses coming from simple mechanical problems. The Jeanne d'Arc, you'll be happy to learn, was not one of them. It was still running, even without its gun, and would once again sort of physically destroy some German positions, with all of its weapons damaged by the time that the crossroads was later taken. The Jeanne d'Arc would be hit around 90 times by German anti-tank guns, before its luck ran out, and instead of being hit by another 3.7 centimeter round, it was hit by an 88mm shell, which hit the tank and sort of knocked it out of action, wounding some of the crew, and so eventually it finally had to be abandoned. Even after this successful attack, they took the village, they took the crossroads. The French tanks were eventually forced to surrender the crossroads and retreat back to the village, due to a simple lack of fuel and ammunition. While the attack that we just discussed had been relatively successful, for many of the French units that attacked on the 28th, they ran into some of the same problems that the British had had the day before. Just one well-placed German anti-tank gun could cause havoc among the armored forces if they didn't have the Char B1s. As long as the gun was sort of capable of quickly damaging the tanks that it was facing, they were a real threat. For example, in one area of the attack, 20 S-35 tanks were quickly halted by a single 88mm flak gun that was being used in an anti-tank role, with 17 of those French tanks being destroyed. Overall, this attack would kind of be a mixed bag, sort of this attack on the 28th, with some French successes balanced against some failures. But at least some territory was taken and held at the end of the attack, which was an advantage over what had happened the day before, and this prompted de Gaulle to begin to prepare for another effort on May 29th. What remained of the French armored forces would then spend the night refueling and replenishing their ammunition stocks for the next day of action. Along the front, the attacks would kick off just after 7 a.m., with a particular point of focus being continuing the attack towards the crossroads that we just spoke about. In this area, 7 of the Char B1s were still operational, and they would be sent into action. On another area of the French front, the armored units and colonial infantry units were attacking another village, with the armored units equipped with the far smaller and lighter R-35 tank. Here is a quote from Lieutenant René Bardel, a platoon leader of an R-35 unit. Quote, "As soon as we started, the khaki coats jumped behind us and followed across the plateau. The infantry seemed to be particularly eager this morning. Smoke now hid the hedgerow in front of us. The German machine guns hidden there were firing madly, keeping our infantry down on the ground. At full speed, our platoon attacked them. This was the tank's job. The red bursts of our 37mm guns flashed all along the hedgerow. Earth, branches flew up. But the enemy held their ground. A sudden shock rang out on my armor, and a flame flashed into the turret. We had been hit. I hastily trained the turret to the right, and there, between the two trees, I saw the white flash of a 37mm anti-tank gun firing at us. Of us two, who was going to die? I would prefer that it was them. One shot after another. I fired 3 shots, the cases falling down into my tank. Suddenly, a firework display lit up under the trees. I had probably hit their ammunition box. I fired half a magazine from my machine gun and another shell. I had got them." End quote. During these attacks, real progress was being made, but it never seemed like there were enough French tanks. Because generally, as the tank units melted away due to German fire, so did the hope of any further French victories. This would happen time and time again along the front, with, sometimes 88mm guns destroying a number of R-35 tanks, which then slowed and then halted the attack. Then, in another area, 4 Char B1s were leading a French advance before being fired on by 10.5cm artillery guns that were firing directly at the tanks, eventually disabling 3 of them. In both cases, once the tanks were out of action, the attacks simply ended. By the end of the day, there were very few tanks still remaining operational. All that de Gaulle's attacks had done was simply to compress the German bridgehead down further towards the center of Abbeville without kind of making the progress that would seriously threaten the bridgehead or its ability to be used to stage further attacks. The French units involved in the attacks were quickly running out of the ability to continue, and the German resistance did not seem to be wavering. De Gaulle would give it one final go on May 30th. Focusing his remaining armor against the important Mount Kamal, but this attack quickly ended, with more tanks being disabled by German fire. When all of the attacks were over, while the destruction of the French tanks, with over 100 being lost during the 3 days of the attack, would be the most obvious sort of reason for the attacks to end, the French infantry units were also suffering from mounting casualties, with some of the units suffering half of their strength in casualties during the 3 days. On the German side, losses were also mounting, with over 1,000 casualties in the 57th Infantry Division, and every single one of their 3.7cm anti-tank guns being put out of action, along with 2 of the 4 88mm guns that had been so critical to the defense. So they were not doing exactly well. While these German losses were quite serious, and they were pretty heavy losses when you kind of look at all of the forces that they had involved in the defense, on the French side, they believed that the German losses were even heavier, and that they might be close to actually making real progress or causing the German defensive positions to collapse. And this caused French High Command and General Weygand to order another series of attacks against the Abbeville bridgehead, even though, first British and then French armored forces had attempted it and not really gotten anywhere. They did still have more troops to use as well, and for the next attack, another French armored division was brought in, the 2nd Armored Division, a division that had previously suffered heavy losses, but which had been rebuilt by the addition of several new armored companies with Char B-1 BIS tanks, Char D-2 tanks, and then some H-39 light tanks. By the time that it was committed to the attack on Abbeville, it would have 140 tanks in its order of battle, but due to mechanical breakdowns and other issues, when it was in a position to attack, only around 100 of those tanks were still available. This next plan would be led not by a Frenchman, but instead the British Major General Fortune. He was the commander of the newly arrived 51st Highland Division. The basic concept that he put together and his staff put together was not that much different than what had come before, with multiple simultaneous attacks on multiple different areas of the bridgehead. There would be multiple days of delay before this final effort could be made, though, and the attack would start not on, the 31st of May, but instead June 4th, which would give 4 days for the Allies to prepare, but also the Germans. During this time, the German 57th Division reinforced its positions and placed multiple new minefields, which would be very important to the upcoming offensive. These minefields had 2 important consequences. The first was that they simply disabled a bunch of French tanks, including a lot of the Char B-1 tanks that were so important to French successes. And then it also had once again the effect of separating the tanks from their infantry support. This was a constant problem experienced by Allied armor during these attacks, and once again, it would be their undoing. Some of the French tanks actually made it to their final objective, the summit of Mont Chaumont, which they had been striving for since the first days of de Gaulle's attacks a week earlier. But once they arrived at their destination, they would be forced to retreat because there was simply no infantry around. And so they could either retreat and try to save their tanks, or stay there and eventually be destroyed for no real gain. The British attacks would be similarly unsuccessful on their areas of the front, and by the afternoon of June 4th, it was clear that the Abbeville bridgehead would survive at least another day. This meant that at the end of the day, 3 total Allied armored divisions, 1 British and 2 French, had been mauled in their attacks against the bridgehead, for very little gain, to be honest. 3 powerful units that would have been very nice to have as counterattack forces if the Germans were to attack from their bridgeheads along the Somme in force. Kind of like what they would do the very next day on June 5th, 1940. But that's a story for next episode.